I think Malone has taken the right approach by keeping the starting lineup the same, at least for now. You don't want to confuse those roles unnecessarily. He had this very good all-around offensive game because of his downhill aggression. He fakes out the defense, makes it look like he's going to keep and drive, gets Julian a wide open three and nailed that shot.
I'm lower on the start Russ bandwagon. His stats are so good it's hard to deny, but
it's not that hard.
Okay.
You can just say no. Do you know what Russ is shooting in corner threes this season? 46%. If you asked me 6 months ago, whose shooting I want to give to Christian Brown, and I said Russell Westbrook, actually.
He hit 2 threes in that Mavs game, and if CB's three is down, how long are you going to wait? Peyton taking off is changing the narrative of this team.
If there was somebody that I would take Christian out of the starting lineup for, it would be Peyton. We should really talk about just the general Nuggets point guard situation. So like you've mentioned, after we've gone through our sort of game by game breakdown, Jamal's been hit or miss again, right? He was bad in both Spurs games, like no question, particularly scoring. I didn't think his passing was actually that bad. It just didn't like pop. He was great versus both the Celtics and the Clippers. I thought he's mad at himself for missing a couple shots in the Celtics game, but I thought that other than that, like he's the reason that they were, neck and neck with the Celtics throughout this entire game, just being the engine of the offense. And then in the Clippers game, they get a blowout win with him as the main engine of the offense for sure. One of the things with that Clippers game that I just want to point out was the variety of ways that Jamal was creating for others. I think a lot of people point to like, okay, he had his 20 points. It was pretty efficient, but it's combining that with the distribution that I'm really, looking at. We've been talking throughout the whole season about this, like Jamal is a combo guard and what it means to be the point guard for this team when he also has this like scoring first role that he's in different phases of the game. So I talked about the lob passes that he gets to Peyton behind the defense, and those are always really fun because you're like, wow, this possession looks broken, but it turns out there is an open pass available to a cutting Peyton, and sometimes he'll hit them from like 30 feet out. And I'm like, those are actually like, he's a really good lob passer, Jamal is, and it makes you wonder. He looks really good when he's playing next to DJ in that sense, and even AG. It makes you wonder how his development would have been different if Jokić was like a lob threat, or if they had other lob threats on the roster throughout those like earlier years of Jamal's development. Because you're kind of wondering, like, where did he learn how to lob pass like this?
Yeah, he's very like accurate and has good touch on them. Like maybe he could do some of that
the
with
Nuggets
AG
didn't get
or
like
something.
super athletic until 2023, from my understanding of the rosters post Kenneth Reed.
I mean, you had like Jeremy Grant and who was a vertical spacer, but it's not like Jamal was lobbing it to him. So
right.
Yeah, it's been interesting.
Yeah, so you kind of wonder like where did all that come from? Because in 2023 they put it all together in those playoffs. There were lots of like lob dunks to AG, to Bruce, to Christian for sure, right? And now we're seeing it with Peyton and DJ. There was that handoff pass to Julian in transition where he basically fakes out the defense, makes it look like he's going to keep and drive as the defense thinks that he likes to do. So that's another way that he can weaponize the way that defenders guard him. And I think he was in like transition, semi-transition, gets Julian a wide open three, and I believe Julian nailed that shot. Drives and dump offs to DJ out of pick and roll. For sure. He was getting downhill, I feel like, a lot more in this game, and he was definitely kicking out some, but there were also, interior passes that were open to him because he was getting downhill to the point where like that in combination with his shot making in that game where he was hitting his turnarounds, he was hitting all his fadeaway shots, he was hitting his transition pull-up threes as we like to see him even take in the first place. The Clippers started blitzing him. And like we've seen in other games where the Nuggets are playing without Jokić, where Jamal is playing without Jokić in particular, he gives up the ball, and often the possession will like stagnate after that because the Nuggets just aren't good at playing in advantage situations for whatever reason sometimes. But I do think in that game, he was good about giving the ball up and then getting it back. and being in a situation where it was difficult for the Clippers to blitz him. And also, they know we've seen it in previous games. So it's like, well, there's no Jokić here. Like, whatever outlet he's going to have isn't as good, which is why it's important that he plays with someone else who can play out of blitzes. I think that that's one of the reasons that the Russ and Jamal bench lineups have thrived this season, and especially when the two of them have MPJ out there. All of that was happening because of his downhill aggression early. And so they did have advantages that were created out of that. And so I was just like really impressed with he had this very good all around offensive game in the Clippers, and then two stinkers that followed because of his knee. Versus the Mavs, I do want to give like a harsher criticism here, because regardless of the knee, I just thought his processing speed was really slow in that game. And it's a big reason that they had such a slow start offensively. He was just missing a lot of easy passing reads to Jokić because he was like taking so long to process what was going on with the defense. It was just like watching a rookie out there where it's like, is the game going too fast for him kind of thing? But obviously we know that's not true. It's his 7th year in the NBA. Right?
Yeah, is he like he's the injury, or if it's pain or whatever is like first on his mind or something, and he's just not like playing freely, or what's happening,
It's one of the things is like Jamal needs to be better at some of these marginal things. Like he needs to get sharper at it, because if he is going to play, well, at least 4 more years in the NBA, because he's under contract for another 4 years after this one, with the Nuggets right now. He's gonna have times where he's injured, right? And trying to play through injury and trying to impact the game in other ways. And needs to be like my dream is that he gets to the point of like point guard play of like a Mike Conley, or close to it, like 90% of a Mike Conley, within the next like year or two, because then it won't matter when you have these like stinkers, scoring wise and all of that, because you'll be able to just set other guys up more and just play like a smarter brand of basketball. And it's just weird because we saw him do that to like a really high level versus the Clippers, who are great defense, right? And he was healthy in that game. Like he wasn't having the knee soreness in that game. But then like completely forgot like every part of offense versus the Nets, and then definitely versus the Mavs.
Well, I mean, this is partly why we wanted to, hone in on this point guard position with the Nuggets specifically, because, Russ, we'll talk more about him, but the way that, I mean, not only is Jamal kind of struggling and coming back from an injury postseason and offseason, now he's having to learn how to exist next to Russ. And it's not like it's bad. Like those minutes have been good. We're talking about him being relegated more to off-ball minutes because Russ is better on ball. And, we have mixed results with him getting to spots off ball and off screens and such. That's going to lean more towards him having success the more he embraces that. I don't know if Russ is actually going to start or not. Like we'll talk about that soon. But like if he does start, Jamal is going to have to play much more off ball. Like a tough philosophical
we're kind of seeing
change.
It now with Russ starting in place of another
definitely.
starter, right?
It'll just continue to grow, and like I'm imagining more of those types of things happening as time goes on. And it's just weird because it's like what used to be the best 2-man game in the league, Jamal and Jokić, is the most reliable kind of play. Obviously different now because you don't have KCP in the other corner spacing. You have Aaron Gordon in a dunker, and then Russ off ball, and that's going to mess up the spacing. And Jamal's going to drive into a wall or drive into aimlessly around the court, or not having an open pocket pass to Jokić. Like this spacing is affecting everyone on the team. This is just going to be a question. But yeah, if you want to get into like how Jamal, like that problem, if you want to even talk about it, or just talk about Russ, we can dive into some of that.
Well, I mean, Russ has been playing really, really well lately, particularly with the starters, because everybody plays well with the starters, right? I don't know if we've talked about this on the show before, but Russ might be like the biggest Jokić merchant of all time. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I just mean, if you look at the splits with Jokić on versus off the floor, like Russ's splits, it's stark. You'd think like, okay, maybe there's some shooting variance there. He's shooting about 32% from 3, both on with Jokić on and off the floor. So that's not really it. the rim, Russ is shooting, I believe, 72% at the rim with Jokić on the floor and like 50% at the rim with Jokić off.
Yeah. I guess, Jokic is easier to get that, better looks around the rim, when Russ is playing
Because
with
the
him.
defense is so worried about him
Yeah.
that
And
you
just,
end up getting that
and Jokic's
that
ability
driving lane.
to hit him in like more
Yeah.
advantage situations with cutting to the rim and
That's
dunking.
true. He
stuff
gets
like
more
that.
of those like wide open layups, not necessarily ones that he creates for himself, whereas he's creating all of the ones for himself when Jokić is off the floor.
Yeah. Which is harder to finish, but Russ's
But
athleticism.
50%, yeah, for
He's still
sure.
finishing them, which is great. I mean, I could imagine a world where he was playing with Jokic and smoking layups, and he's not doing that, which is amazing. But,
There has been this conversation of should Russ start because he benefits. Just because he's a Jokic merchant doesn't mean he shouldn't start, because maybe the argument is like, if we're going to get the most out of this guy, we should play him as much with Jokic as possible. What's your thought on the question of whether Russ should start?
oh man, who like you're starting Russ maybe over Christian, for example, and that sounds good because then Christian, you're like, oh, Christian's coming off the bench, and that's what we've kind of been missing because he was a great kind of rotation piece off the bench, even though I thought he struggled off the bench last year. And every player is going to benefit from playing like more with the starters, whether it's Christian, Russ, or Pwat, who could also be in the conversation of starting. Like everyone's just going to be more productive. I'm in favor of maybe trying it out. I don't know. I'm kind of lower on the start Russ bandwagon just because I think he has like a good attitude and approach. I think if you can rotate him into Jokic minutes more off the bench, that's great. It's just so tough. His stats are so good, it's hard to deny. But like some people,
I mean, it's not that hard.
okay,
You can just say no.
but yeah, some people, like as good as Russ have been, I thought have a good argument that I've seen. Russ, just the way he plays and the philosophical way that he plays, pushes the Nuggets identity in a certain way where, obviously the pace is increased. It's a lot of rim attempts because, he's cutting to the rim. He's not a volume 3-point shooter. And there are ways to mitigate like his spacing concerns in his three by, having him screen or cut. But it just is changing the style of offense that you're wondering if it's like too risky to like commit to in a starting way down the line.
Yeah, I think I agree with that in part. Like that's definitely one of the reasons, because you're not sure how it'll actually shake out down the line. Like we have a really nice, it's not that we have a small sample size, but that's what it is. Like it's a few weeks of Russ playing really well with the starters in the regular season, largely against some like not great teams. I was really impressed that he played well versus the Mavs yesterday. Like that definitely mattered to me. I thought he was actually good throughout that game. I didn't think that he was consistently good in past games against good teams. Even with Jokic on the floor, he was making a lot of mistakes, but particularly with Jokic off, right? But we're talking about if he's starting, he's playing more with Jokic. And I think that that is probably the best argument for starting Russ
Yeah.
is like, we're going to get the most out of him because we'll get more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff because he's playing with Jokic. But it's not that I feel bad for CB. I just think that starting Russ full time is not something you can just try out because it's really hard to walk back from that, right? Like just sort of in terms of like player politics stuff. If it ends up not going well and you need to go back to Christian starting or even Peyton starting, then you're like, okay, I got to get the 36-year-old who played really well, played himself into a starting position, and then it's not working. It's like, how much runway do you give him? And Malone likes to give guys a lot of runway, especially vets that try as hard as Russ does. I don't think it's a good idea to start him really just for that reason. Because basketball wise, there's a lot of reasons to want that to happen. One of the things that I've been tracking all season, and we talked about it on our lineups show, is Russ and Peyton playing together. Just those minutes are not good. Even with Jokic on the floor, you're talking about like single digit positive like net ratings where you need to be closer to like 10 plus in all those minutes with Jokic just to maximize them. With Jokić off the floor, it's just like, oh my god, like the worst two-man net rating since Russ and Dario, right? um, and if Russ is starting, you separate those guys a bit more because Peyton is playing more in those bench units without Russ, and even like depending on Russ's like substitution pattern, maybe Peyton is playing in uh, um, those stagger minutes with Jokić as well. Jamal's going to start. That's the other thing about this is like maybe you're like, oh, with Christian, it's like, well, no, Jamal's going to start, and that's not changing. And actually, we need to figure out how to make that work. One of the things I've been looking at all season is like, how good is the starting lineup? We don't have a ton of data about that because of all the time that AG has missed. But before AG went out with the second time with the calf strain, it was clear that in the month of December, the starters' offense was really sputtering, actually. And they were not winning their minutes. That's again before AG's, and they barely played in December. It's a very small game sample size and all of that. But it kind of made me think like, "Ugh, maybe the coaching staff is like, we need a little bit of a spark here just to kind of like get us through this." But that that um that lineup data was very concerning to me, and it still is. And I'm curious what things are going to look like once AG does return to the starting lineup, because he did come off the bench in this last game. Um, because we have to make our starting lineup work. Like our starting lineup has to be good. And whether that means like changing the starters or just playing better, right? Like I would like to make sure that the five guys we started the season with can play really well together, because they started off like a plus 18 and now they're like at a plus 8 on the season, which tells you that they've definitely petered out.
Hmm.
So that could be one of the things again in favor of like the starting unit needs a bit of a bump.
A
But I
boost.
think a lot of that has to do with Jamal. And the fact of the matter is we're not winning a championship if Jamal doesn't like get back to a more competent level consistently, because we just need him to in order to beat playoff level defenses. As good as Russ has been, I see him as more of a, at least with Jokić, raising the floor of like, okay, we can do a lot of really good stuff with this guy on the floor when Jamal is not at 100. Whether Jamal is there or not, like the Russ plus Jokić duo is really good. But in terms of what's going to happen with those lineups in a playoff setting, like a Russ, Christian, AG trio with MPJ and Jokić, is like, that's not doing anything offensively
Yeah, I don't
against a
want
team
that.
like the Mavs or the Wolves in an actual playoff series, right? So the impetus for wanting Russ to start, I think, should be more of a motivation to make sure that we can get the other things working. Um, but I do want to talk a little bit more about Russ closing, because I've had a lot of mixed feelings about Russ closing games this season, in particular because of what it does to the offense. But the defense with Russ on the floor in place of either Christian or Jamal has been pretty good. Um, in this stretch of games, we had a bunch of close games and clutch games, and those have been the ones where I'm most concerned about the offense with Russ, because that's when the game slows down. That's when other teams can scheme a little bit more effectively, just because everybody's in place. We're not, worrying about transition or semi-transition and guys getting in cross matches and all of that in these close games between the two Spurs games, the Nets game, and the Mavs game. The Nets didn't actually, I don't think, reach the clutch, but it was close for a bit after the Nets made a run to cut the lead down, and the Nuggets had to kind of slow play it and get things back under control. And they closed with Russ because Jamal had to leave that game. Or they closed with Russ only because Jamal had to leave that game. And I thought the main difference between the games where it has worked with Russ closing, like the offense has worked with Russ closing and not, is that Russ has been on ball, right? In that first Spurs game, there was that viral clip going around of the last offensive possession for the Nuggets where they were down one. They needed a bucket to take the lead, and Jokić ends up, he posts up Wemby, and then I believe it's Keldon Johnson leaves Russ in the corner to go double him. to go double Jokić in the post, and Jokić is trying to find the open corner shooter, and it's Russ because MPJ is screening. I'm just like, what is going on in this final play? It's kind of a disaster. And then he ends up turning the ball over to Devin Vassell. It was like an way off target pass too. Like he wasn't even close to getting it to Russ or whatever. But all of that. There's a bunch of layers of what happens in that play, right? First of all, Jokić is trying to post up Wemby, and he started to pass the ball even before Keldon Johnson comes over to double. Is the other thing, because he's like, I don't have the angle to get a shot on this guy right now. Two, why is Russ the one in the corner spacing with MPJ screening for him?
I know.
Like, what is going on here? Three, Jamal was open at the top of the key because his guy was kind of pinching it on Jokić too, and Jokić ends up like throwing the ball the other way. And then his pass is off target, and Devin Vassell picks it off. They get a run out on the other end. The Spurs ends up winning that game. I thought that in the second Spurs game, the one that goes to overtime, in regulation, we had more of Jamal Jokić two-man game, but it was Jokić operating out of the middle of the floor. It's not so much like him on the block or trying to get down to like deep in the paint. So like I said, he had that opportunity with to take a jumper to tie. And I thought the Spurs just did a good job with their hedging and recovering so that Wemby was always able to stay on Jokić. So that was whatever. But in overtime, in addition to they had a bunch of defensive stops, so they were getting out in transition more to score in overtime. They had a lot of Russ on the ball, running two-man game with Jokić, and then cutting off of him and getting open layups on the back end. And that's the exact same thing that happened in the Mavs game and the Nets game to close. How do you feel about what that could look like with Russ more on ball, closing games in a playoff setting?
I mean, it's nerve-wracking to think about, but if he's going to have success in that setting, he's got to be on ball because there's just too many ways to exploit it otherwise, I think. I get, it's a regular season thing. We're trying to get as many wins in the regular season as we can. We want to be a high seed so that we can compete. And Russ is bringing that to the table and helping us win games. And he's putting up a lot of stats. The production's good. With these injuries, with AG being out and being able to start Russ, which is, we wouldn't even really know what this would look like if that didn't happen.
Yeah.
Part of the reason why it's just so hard for Malone to be super intentional about, like maybe he should have had Julian in on that last Spurs play when we lost. I know Jokić took responsibility for that.
But also, like, maybe Russ could have been screening for Mike.
Yeah, sure.
Because
sure.
Mike wasn't
yeah,
even acting as a spacer on that final play. He was like,
yeah.
This is like what happens when you also have like AG out and like, okay, it's like, I'm playing the 4. So like, this is what AG would do for me. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, I don't like that was like.
That's a big question about who's the 2 and who's the 1 is, AG and Mike. And like, Mike's been playing well at the 4 too. And, it's weird to have so many questions about the starting lineup and how to like form it and shape it, which shouldn't be too surprising with the fact that, that CB's a new starter. Just about how do you maximize the Nuggets' best like punch in a way and get it more consistently. And if the answer is start Russell Westbrook, then that's the answer. But if it's not, I mean, I will say I feel more confident about Russ playing in a playoff situation after watching like him recently than I was at the very beginning of the season where we thought he wouldn't maybe even play. But, thankfully in a playoff situation, more starters will be playing with him. So I feel like he could be okay. And he holds up defensively more, which is good. But if teams are like super exploiting it, we better like adjust to that quickly.
That's the thing for me is like closing wise, I don't know that there's a ton of difference between him and Christian closing because teams aren't like, they're not guarding Christian either. The difference I will say that's a little bit more consistent with Christian is that his off-ball cutting is more, and his timing on that is more consistent. But Russ is getting better at that too now.
Yeah,
I just wonder, the thing is like, Russ has to be like, he has to give the entry to Jokić and they're kind of running, it's a 2-man game, but Russ is off the ball now that he's given it to Jokić. Whereas Christian is fine, like spacing from whatever and cutting from wherever. I don't know how great like Russ's timing on that always is when he's being ignored from like 2 passes away as opposed to the 1, right? Um, Christian is a more reliable above the break 3-point shooter. Do you know what Russ is shooting in corner threes this season? Well,
Is it like,
so I told you he's shooting about 32%.
is it 37%?
It's 46%.
Oh man. Yeah, he
And
made.
he's like 50% in one corner and like 42% in the other quarter.
Was it against the
Corner.
Mavs where he hit 2 corner threes?
He hit
Or
a
was it
couple
the
more
Nets?
against the Mavs too, yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of crazy.
It's
to
like
think
if we could just give CB either obviously Russ's ball handling, that would be amazing. Like we would just be cooking if that were the case. If we could give CB Russ's corner 3-point shooting. Can you imagine like if you asked
Oh.
me 6 months ago, who's shooting I want to give to Christian Brown?
Would
And
not
I
be
said
Russ.
Russell Westbrook, actually. His corner 3-point shooting. That would have been awesome. But
Yeah.
like 46% for me. It's not on high volume, right? He's not taking a lot of them, but he's making the ones that he gets. That's the other thing I'm thinking. Like after I looked at those numbers, I was thinking, man, if Jokić could have just delivered that pass to Russ in the corner, he might have made that shot in that Spurs game. But Christian has also made a couple of big shots in the clutch and whatever. It's just like with all of these guys, Peyton too. Sometimes they make them and sometimes they don't. And it's not even the case. Casey didn't always make his corner threes. It just felt like he did. He didn't have like, especially like the ones in the clutch, but it felt like it was always going in,
Yeah.
right? Like you just trusted that more. So I think a lot of the conversation around this stuff is very like vibes based. Like there was in the Wizards game, like Julian had multiple opportunities at threes and he just didn't make them. Even though he was like a plus 18 in that game, like or plus 8, I forget. And he scored a lot in that game like throughout, but in the clutch, like he wasn't able to make those shots. And it's not, I don't even think that that's like Julian has also made other shots in the clutch in other games that he's gotten the opportunity to close earlier in the season. It's just one of those things where you're like, this conversation is born out of none of these guys are KCP. I don't trust them. So we should cycle through them and whatever.
Yeah.
But I think Malone has taken the right approach to this, like in terms of just the starters, by keeping the starting lineup the same, at least for now, because you want that stability and you want guys' general roles to be clear cut so that they know like what they're going to be doing every night. And I think I do think that that's more important because it's Russell Westbrook. And it's not just for him, but for the other guys in the roster. Like you don't want to confuse those roles unnecessarily. In the title year, Bruce started whenever any starter was out. So he played a ton. He started a ton next to like on this team. And played a bunch next to Jokić and all of that. But when push came to shove in the playoffs, he was coming off the bench and that was just known that was what it was going to be. I had a question for you actually. In the title year, because I wasn't watching that team from the beginning of that season. I know KCP was making more money, but it wasn't that much more than Bruce. Like it was double, but it was like 5 or 6 million more.
Mhm.
Was it clear from training camp that KCP would be the starting shooting guard?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was all,
So
I don't think
that was clear from the beginning.
I don't think it was ever questioned that like
Okay.
Bruce would ever be a starter over KCP and such. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know some people have talked about, especially friend of the show, Matt Moore, has talked about the seeming investment that the team has in Christian more long term. I don't think that they're gonna not risk that, but like they want him to become a starter. So they need to play him like a starter and like hope that he becomes a starting, like a more closer to a starting caliber player.
That's my bigger point is maybe if we were more desperate and the seeding was lower and like our record was worse and it was just like, damn, we need something because this is like starting.
Yeah.
We're panicking. Change the starting
Right.
lineup. Right now, we're like sitting pretty. Russ filled in for a starter. We won games and it's like that's what like part of why we got Russ. It's like fill in, help, be a depth piece, come in, start if you need to. help us win. And that's what he did. So you should probably say, thank you, send him back to the bench. Try to use what you've learned from him starting in other ways, like when you're rotating him in off the bench. And if you want to close with him in certain spots, then go ahead if he's playing well. I am leaning more towards CB or Pwat starting, just because the Nuggets are going to be so much better off if one of them like seriously starts taking off.
I agree.
You got to play for that upside, and it's like it might be painful and it sucks to watch young players like struggling.
Yeah.
And maybe you're more forgiving of Russ.
It's very painful watching Russ make mistakes too, though, I will say.
He just makes up for it more quickly than other guys. And I think, Russ is an, assisting maestro. So, he brings value so easily that way with the right players.
That's true. Like, he makes Jokic's job a lot easier.
Yeah. So that is
which I think has a lot of value.
Yeah. That is a big argument for starting him. And I do want to play him more with Jokić rather than being like the bench.
And obviously the easiest way to do that is by starting him. But you also want to play these other guys with Jokić. Like we've been talking about this all season, how important it is that these young players get a lot of reps with Jokić so that we have like lineup versatility, and also like playing with Jokić helps their own development and things like that. And it's just like there are only 48 minutes in the game, and really like on a maximum 38 minutes to play of Jokić minutes times 4 other players on the floor for players to play next to Jokić, and there's just not enough of him to go around.
Yeah.
Right. That's the real problem. Like if Jokić could just play 48 minutes, then none of these are even questions.
And then what does it do to the bench unit? Because then it's like, okay, who's your starting 2 guard? And then it's like, then CB's coming in first off the bench in the 2 spot, and then now Julian's not playing, which maybe you want because Julian's not playing so well. It has all ripple effects, and it's just like how do you want to handle it? And probably we're best just keeping one of these guys in the starting unit. But I am leaning more towards trying Peyton as a starter. So let's talk about Pwat to like close the show out.
Yeah, actually related to what we were just talking about with the shooting and like who we trust in the clutch. Who do you think are the 2 highest 3-point percentage shooters in the clutch on this team?
Well, I mean, now I feel like it has to be Pwat because you're asking me.
I said 2, so he's definitely one of them. He's shooting 60% from 3 in the clutch.
Pwat and Jokić?
Jokić is shooting 50%. He's actually 3rd. It's Christian.
Oh, geez.
Christian is shooting 57% on his clutch threes this season. It's not like it's a ton, right?
Yeah.
These guys usually aren't getting a ton of 3-point shots in the clutch because we're trying to create 2s almost as much as possible. Christian has 7 attempts. Pwat has 5. So very, very low sample sizes here. But yeah, Peyton's made his clutch threes at a pretty high clip this season. He is also another player that's in the running for some of these closing minutes, and really in place of whoever, in place of Mike, in place of Christian, and in place of AG in this case because AG is injured. But we've had other games where Peyton has closed in place of those guys when they weren't injured, and it was just like a better matchup for them. I've been incredibly impressed with Peyton Watson really this whole season, particularly defensively. He had a stretch, I think, in like mid to late December where things kind of tailed off on that end. He was really getting bullied on the ball by like smaller players that were just kind of burying him under the rim and then getting a layup out of it. So that was really annoying, him playing on ball. He has, I think, recovered a bit from that. But Peyton has taken on a variety of roles throughout this whole season, but particularly over this most recent stretch of the last 2 weeks or so. In the game versus the Hawks, he had this great block when he was guarding Trey on the ball in pick and roll. Trey gets in front of him, obviously, because Trey is very small, very quick, and Peyton has to trail him, but does so very effectively and utilizes his 7'1" wingspan to block the ball from behind, and the Nuggets, it turns into a run out for the Nuggets, and they are able to score on the other end. So that's on the ball stuff. In this most recent Mavs game, we saw a big difference between when MPJ is the low man versus when AG or even Peyton is the low man. There was this play in the Mavs game where I forget who's running the pick and roll, but Peyton kind of rotates over to tag. I think it's Maxi Kleber on the roll. I don't even think he had to, and I was kind of like, "Why are you pinching in so much there?" Because I'm pretty sure Jokić is like there in time to recover, and he leaves. I think it's Najee Marshall in the corner, and Peyton is able to recover all the way back to the 3-point line and block his shot. And I definitely thought that was up and in because Najee Marshall just likes to cook us. But it's just like he's able to make all these great athletic plays, and we've talked a lot about especially in his on-ball role, how he is like a better screen navigator than Christian, just because he has more like margin for error basically on his recovery around screens. And it's true in low man possessions as well, right? And he and Christian are both very athletic, but obviously Peyton has the length to, contest shots at the rim. He has, I think, better timing for sure than MPJ in low man situations, just making sure he tags that big in time. But I think just like his presence on the floor generally makes a really big difference in the Nuggets defensively. Like he's basically involved in all of my favorite defensive games of the season, which have been especially like ones that were like were close and came down to like final possessions, like versus the Thunder early in the year for sure. Obviously, this Mavs game was big. The game versus the Spurs in overtime. I actually thought in that if I had a criticism of Malone in that first game, like Payton played really well in that first game, particularly defensively. And it wasn't just on Wemby. And I thought he should have played more in that game. And I think Malone agreed, which is why he played him so much in that second game. He has started to really show more consistent signs of being like a defensive presence in a variety of ways on the floor for us. Has anything stood out to you?
To be like very transparent, I've been in and out on pretty much all the Booth boys like over this
Yeah.
little stretch. Like I've been like high on Julian and like wanting to play him more, and then now I'm like pretty low on him. And I've been out on Pwat and been like, I don't know that he's the right fit for this team. Like, yeah, he has a super high ceiling and potential, but like we're just like not getting it, and we don't have the time to wait for it and all that. And then when I saw him playing against Wemby in that second Spurs game, I was like, oh dang, he's untouchable. We can't get rid of this guy. That's just like so valuable, just to have super long guys who can be employed differently against very threatening offensive players. My eyes was almost open to Pwat in that moment. And if you're a listener and you're always high on Pwat, like congratulations. Like I'm more skeptical of like players who aren't showing offensive upside, because I care more about that. But we do need versatile defense around Jokić, and he's the staple of the Nuggets. So I'm more leaning towards never trading Pwat. Please keep him with the Nuggets. Could he be a starting two? I'm starting to be on that train. I don't want to take Mike or AG out of the starting lineup, so it's just like by necessity would have to do that. I get that he's not the typical two, but I've been more like on that side of him being more towards the 3 or the 2 than the 4, even though he did play good at the 4 for AG when he was out. It's a question of how he's going to develop and where where he's going to end up like kind of being and solidifying himself. So we were going to talk about this, but I don't think we did. The flash he had to the free throw line when Julian couldn't enter the ball to Jokić, and then he flashed, and then he did the pass to Jokić and got on that ball. Just cool little smart moves like that is good to see. And he hit 2 threes in that Mavs game. And if CB's 3 is down, how long are you going to wait until you're just like, let's just play Peyton? Because Peyton taking off is changing the narrative of this team.
I completely agree with that question. For sure. Yeah. We should talk a little bit more about some of his offensive flashes in this stretch as well. So versus the Nets, he actually had a really nice drive and finish through contact. He's been finishing through contact at the rim a lot better lately. It's not that he looks like he's gotten stronger or anything. He just happens to be making these layups through contact more. Maybe it's a focus thing. I don't know what. He's also shooting pretty well at the free throw line, almost 80%. And he's getting more sort of and one opportunities and free throw opportunities as well. In that Nets game, he also had a nice kind of drive, and then like it was like a dump off or maybe a pocket pass to DJ in the lane. This was off off ball. So I think Jamal reverses the ball to him. Peyton gets to attack with an advantage, draws the help, and then DJ is rolling and gets that pocket pass from him and is able to finish. We saw a lot more playmaking from him in that game. He had 5 assists in the first half. I think he finished with 5 assists. So I wanted to see a little bit more in the second half. And I thought he might get more reps actually because Jamal went out. And it seemed like they've been wanting to use him more on the ball, but not so much in the second half in terms of the playmaking. But he definitely flashed some things there. You talked about him flashing middle. I have in my notes here another flash of him being a zone buster because we talked about him being able to break zones that way in other lineups where Malone's kind of gone to him at the 5 in some iterations and in order to break certain zones, and he does have good feel on the floor and just like reading space in that way. And I wish we could see more of that consistently when he plays with Jokić, like to the point where I'm like, if he had Christian's cut timing, I don't think it'd be a question at this point about him starting. But there are some times where he and Mike in particular, you're kind of not always able to trust that they're going to be in the right place on the floor at the same time. Whereas Christian is almost never in the wrong place. So he can't hurt the offense in that way.
His floor is so much higher sometimes.
Exactly.
Pwat, so
Exactly.
Just,
But if Peyton had that cut instinct in terms of just the timing, it's not that he doesn't cut. It's just like the timing but that also comes with just like time and reps and development, right? Like Christian was a 3-year student at Kansas. Is that right? And Peyton was there for 1 year
and never played.
So he didn't really get to develop some of that stuff. But yeah, defensively, I just feel like the ceiling is so high, and even his defensive floor is not as low as I would have thought. He definitely still has lapses. Christian doesn't have lapses, but his floor, I think Peyton's floor is higher than we think just because he has so much margin for error with his tools, and he's not making quite as many mistakes. And he's just, I think, gotten better as the year has gone on. If there was somebody I was going to that I would take Christian out of the starting lineup for, it would be Peyton for that reason, because I'm just curious about what his developmental trajectory could look like.
If you've made it this far, thank you so much for spending time with us. If you're new, please consider subscribing. If you're a lurker and you haven't subscribed yet, consider finally hitting the subscribe button and helping us out. Hit the like button and the notification button. We need all the support we can get. And if you do that for us, we would love it. And just remember that winning is fun and losing sucks.